this video, I'll be installing an insulated ceiling into my new workshop, and later on in the video I'll also talk about the costs and timescales associated with doing the work. Those who've seen my previous videos about the new workshop will know that there is a series of building works that I need to do before I can start equipping the space with tools and stuff. And it made sense to me to put the ceiling in before working on the walls, because a lot of the noise that is coming into the workshop from the nearby road is coming in through the roof. I ordered enough plasterboard to completely cover the ceiling, and it was delivered to my drive via a remote control crane, which was pretty exciting. And it came on a large pallet too, so I look forward to using that pallet wood in future as well. And I used my SketchUp model of my workshop space to figure out how much of it I would need, and I had my brother help me to fix the first couple of sheets to the ceiling, and it was pretty difficult. I really wish I got some footage of it, but unfortunately I didn't, so instead I'll explain how we did it. I carried one end of the plasterboard up a ladder, holding it with one hand and balancing it on my head, while my brother held up the opposite end using a simple T-shaped thing that we made out of some scrap wood. I then needed to hold the sheet in place using my head and one hand while at the top of a ladder, and then I could use my other hand to drive in a few drywall screws using my impact driver. The roof joists we were fixing to are pretty high, about 2.7 meters, and the plasterboard is pretty heavy too, so this method didn't feel particularly safe, plus it was hard work, so after fitting 2 sheets we left it there while I reassessed the situation. I looked into hiring a plasterboard lift, but the cost of that was pretty high. The hire charges are per day, and I figured that I might need it for at least a week because I'm busy with so many other things at the moment. But eventually one came up for sale on Facebook Marketplace locally to me, so I bought it. The cost was £85, and I figured once I used it I could just sell it on again. I thought it'd help me to fit the ceiling on my own without needing any help, and eventually it did, but initially it didn't really go according to plan because when I started using it I was having real problems. The lift would not go up straight. It would either lean to one side or the other. It felt really unstable and unsafe. Also, the wheel which you turn to raise and lower the lift was constantly rubbing on the cable, which made it really difficult to turn, so I had to kind of guide the cable with one hand. To be honest, it was even more difficult than just holding the boards up a ladder with my brother's help, so I thought I'd basically bought a lemon and wasted £85. I wrote to the guy I bought it from, and he was actually really nice and helpful. He said he'd used it a lot with no issues, and he offered to pop round to have a look. When we looked at it, we figured out that the bottom part was not properly seated onto the base, so we disassembled it, reassembled it, and then it looked so much better. We also lubricated all of the moving parts and the cable with some oil, and that really helped with making the wheel easier to turn, so I could then use it to put up the rest of the sheets. Having had a bit of experience with the lift, I would say the downside of using a lift is that it doesn't really speed up the process of fitting the boards all that much. It's pretty time consuming getting it set up, lifted up and moved into position, but the biggest benefit is that it's like having 2 extra pairs of hands holding the sheet, allowing you to fix it in place. After fitting a few boards by myself, my brother came by again to help for the day. As we made progress, one of the most time-consuming things was just moving the contents of my workshop from one side to the other just to clear enough space to manoeuvre the plasterboard lift. But like with anything, after doing something a few times, you soon find the most efficient way of doing things. And this is where we really refined the process of putting the boards up, and things started moving a bit quicker. First we added noggins in between the joists, which would give us some more material to secure the board to with screws from underneath. I got some comments on a previous video saying that the 12.5mm plasterboard is prone to sagging over time if not secured with lots of screws, and as most of my joists are at 600mm centres, I used some 2x3 CLS timber cut to dimensions to fit in between the joists. There seems to be some debate about what spacing is needed in between screws to prevent the sheets from sagging, but I just placed them wherever it looked like extra support might be needed. I'm not going to be skimming this ceiling with plaster, so it's not going to have any extra weight on it. And I didn't want to go too over the top with this because if it sags a bit over time, it's really not the end of the world. It's just a workshop ceiling, it's not like it's a room in my house. I needed to make some cuts to the plasterboard so that the edge of each board would line up with a joist, allowing the next sheet to be butted up against it. I made the cuts by scoring the top layer of paper with a knife using a straight edge to guide it, and then I scored the underside a bit and snapped the board. Next we measured up the centres of the joists and noggins, And we marked those dimensions up onto the white side of the board so that we knew exactly where to add screws to get a secure fixing. It was important to figure out what orientation the board would be in when it was fixed to the ceiling before marking up the positions. We could then lift the board onto the lift, much easier to do that when the lift is tilted, and then tilt it to its horizontal position and crank it up. Once it was close to the ceiling, we could manoeuvre the lift until the board was in the right place, then crank it up all of the way and add the screws. And I used some 38mm drywall screws. Once there were enough screws in to hold the sheet, we could lower the lift, move it out of the way, and add the rest of the screws to secure the sheet. I also needed to drill holes using a spade bit so that I could pull the electrical cables through, which were already in position, ready for the lights to be fitted later on. And then we could fill all of the screw holes, which was a bit of a repetitive job. After adding each sheet of plasterboard, I could then add insulation on top, and I decided to use 50mm thick sound slab by Rockwool. I chose it firstly because I've used it before when I built my shed extension and I was really happy with how effective it was, and secondly, it's much cheaper than some of the other types of insulation available to buy. In a previous video I talked about using this insulation for both the ceiling and in between battens that I'm going to be adding to the walls, and I bought enough of it to do exactly that. However, after reading some of the comments on my previous videos and taking some advice from one of those commenters who is a professional builder, I actually changed my mind. And that's because I was told that the block walls that my workshop was built with are actually pretty effective acoustically and thermally. So the feedback was that using all of the insulation in the roof space, effectively doubling it up to 100mm instead of using a single layer of 50mm, would be a more effective way of blocking noise than using a single layer in the loft and the walls around the perimeter. Before making that decision, I thought that I should put that theory about the blocks being good acoustically to the test. So I cranked up my workshop speaker to full volume playing some music, walked out and around the workshop to the back wall of the building and put my ear against the wall, and I could barely hear the music at all, so that kind of validated it for me. So that's what I did. I installed 2 layers of the 50mm insulation instead of 1 in the ceiling, and these slabs are 600mm wide, which was a perfect snug fit in between most of the joists. I did need to cut a few down to size, and I did that using a handsaw, and it cuts so easily that in the end I decided to do most of the cutting while I was actually up in the roof space, which made it a bit quicker because I didn't have to go up and down the ladder so many times. I chose one of the hottest days of the year to do some of this work, which was a bit stupid really, because this stuff is unpleasant to work with at the best of times. It makes your skin itch and you don't want to be breathing in the dust from using this either, so I wore a respirator at all times. It was also really helpful having someone to pass up the slabs of insulation while I was already up in the roof space. By far the hardest part of insulating was definitely installing it to the very corners of the building because of the pitched roof. The roof is very low in those areas, and the fact that I could only reach the corners by laying down on my front and crawling in, and because the joists were 600mm apart, it was pretty hard to just balance on the joists alone. Very uncomfortable, very hot, and also quite dangerous because if I put any body weight on the plasterboards themselves, I'd probably end up falling right through. To seal up the gaps between plasterboard sheets, I was planning to use this joining tape which I bought from Screwfix. It's called joining tape, but actually it's just a roll of paper. You're meant to add filler to the gap first, then wet this joining tape, then stick it on, wait for it to dry, and then filler over that and then sand. I did one small area, but it was obvious that this was going to take way too much time, and as I'm not that fussy about how this ceiling looks, I'm more concerned with how it performs. I decided to instead just use whatever I had to seal the gaps to hand, which happened to be some transparent sealant. White sealant would have been much better because I'm going to be painting the ceiling white, but I didn't have any on hand and I really wanted to get this job done. Finally, to clean up the ceiling, I could sand away any excess filler, and I chose to use my Hikoki oscillating multi-tool with the sander attachment to do that, because A, it's cordless, which obviously makes the job much quicker and easier, and B, it's pretty lightweight compared to some of my other sanders, so holding it above your head for a long period of time isn't all that bad. Again, I didn't go too over the top with this because the function of the ceiling is way more important than the aesthetics, but I just wanted to clean it up a little before adding paint. And I used some Leyland Super Latex matte white paint. Just before I talk about the costs and timescales, I'd like to quickly thank a few people. My brother Alan for helping me to do some of the work, my uncle Kevin, and also thanks to everyone who commented on both my Instagram posts and the previous video with advice, because I don't really know what I'm doing with this stuff. But in particular, Oliver Bezemer, who gave me some great advice via email, Carl at the Straw Boat Workshop, who's done a similar job to his garage recently, and I'll link to his YouTube channel in the description box below, and Andy Mack at Gosforth Handyman, who's also done some similar work to his garage. Link to his channel below too. So timescales. It was a pretty slow start, to be honest, while I was figuring out A, how to use a plasterboard lift, and B, what the most efficient way of fitting the boards was. But like anything, after you do something a few times, you get quicker and better at it. And towards the end of the project, I found that I was able to fit about 5 boards in a day. That includes cutting, adding the noggins, marking up and cutting the plasterboard, lifting it in place, securing it, then adding the insulation on top, and filling all of the screw holes. I'm sure someone who's used to doing this work can do it much quicker than that, but I was quite happy with 5 boards in a day. But the trouble I had with the plasterboard lift and figuring out the best way to do things obviously slowed me down, so I think in total it took me about 5 days to do the ceiling. That includes painting and everything. Now on to the costs. 15 sheets of plasterboard came in at about £104, which is just under £7 per sheet. I got it from Travis Perkins because I have a trade account there, which gives me a little bit of a discount and free delivery. The rock wool insulation I got from eBay. There was a seller on there selling 2 packs of 9 50mm slabs for £56. So in total I spent £335, and that was the best price I could find online. From Screwfix I got a box of 1000 drywall screws. I don't think I even used half of them. That was about £8, and some joining tape, which was about £3, although I never ended up using that. I spent about £3 on filler. I got that from Poundland. The paint was on special offer at £18 from B&Q, and I used about 2 tubes of sealant, which came in at about £6. And the plasterboard lift was £85, but I'll sell that once I'm finished with this job. So in total that's £562 in costs, but hopefully I'll get my money back on the plasterboard lift, which will bring it in at around £477. In terms of what's coming next, I'm going to be adding a loft space in above the ceiling, which I'm going to use for extra storage space. And then after that, I think I'm going to be building the wall in front of my garage doors, which again is going to be insulated, and that's going to hold my double set of PVC doors. All of that work will be covered in future videos. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already for more weekly woodworking content. You can also follow me on Instagram if you want to see what I'm up to more frequently. And if you'd like early access to my videos, exclusive content, free plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos, you can also support the channel on Patreon. There'll be a link to that in the description box below. Thank you for watching. Whoa. Well, that screws in well.